Rain poured down on Chicago's downtown streets as I watched the most powerful moment I have ever witnessed unfold in real time. An elderly man in tattered clothes sat quietly against a brick wall, clutching a small photograph while water dripped from his worn baseball cap. Two police officers approached with the kind of swagger that screamed trouble, but what happened 30 seconds after they put handcuffs on this vagrant would leave these cops on their knees, apologizing to someone they never should have. Underestimated. Can you guess what secret this homeless man was hiding that would turn two seasoned officers into trembling rookies begging for forgiveness? The autumn evening had that particular Chicago chill that cuts through even the thickest jacket, but Marcus Chen seemed immune to the cold as he sat motionless against the old Meridian Bank building. At 65, weathered face, partially hidden beneath his worn Cubs cap, Marcus looked like every stereotype the city wanted to sweep away before the evening commute ended. His clothes had seen better decades patched and repatched until they were more repair than original fabric. But there was something in his posture that suggested this was not a man broken by circumstance, but someone choosing to be exactly where he was for reasons nobody bothered to ask about. The small photograph he held so carefully was the only clean thing about him, protected from the rain by a plastic sleeve that looked like it had been treasured for years. The way he gripped that image told a story of love and loss that most people rushing past would never take the time to understand. Officer Martinez stepped out of the patrol car first, his nervous energy obvious even from across the street where I stood watching this drama unfold. At 28, with barely 3 years on the force, David Martinez still carried that rookie eagerness to prove himself, especially when partnered with a veteran like Johnson, who had a reputation for handling street situations with maximum efficiency and zero patience for what he considered society's disposable problems. Johnson emerged from the driver's side with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from 15 years of viewing human suffering as paperwork to be processed, his hand resting casually on his belt in a gesture designed to establish dominance before any words were spoken. The way they walked toward Marcus told you everything about how this encounter was supposed to proceed. Two representatives of law and order, dealing with what they saw as a minor inconvenience that needed to be cleared away before their shift ended. Martinez kept glancing at his phone, probably checking messages from debt collectors, while Johnson cracked his knuckles like a man preparing for physical labor. Marcus did not acknowledge their presence as they approached, continuing to stare at the photograph with the kind of focus that seemed to irritate Johnson more than any verbal confrontation might have. There is something about being ignored by someone you consider beneath your station that gets under certain people's skin, and Johnson was definitely the type who expected immediate deference from anyone he deemed unworthy of respect. Martinez cleared his throat loudly, the sound echoing off the empty street, waiting for some kind of response that would justify whatever action they had already decided to take before stepping out of their squad car. When Marcus finally looked up, his eyes held a clarity that neither officer expected, a sharp intelligence that seemed completely at odds with his disheveled appearance, but by then, their minds were already made up about how this conversation would proceed. The homeless man's gaze moved slowly from Martinez to Johnson, taking in every detail of their uniforms, their badges, their defensive postures, as if he was cataloging information that might become important later. Johnson's questions came with the practiced rhythm of someone who had performed this routine hundreds of times before demanding identification that he knew Marcus probably did not have, asking for explanations about why he was sitting in a public space, as if poverty itself was a criminal offense that required immediate correction. Martinez played his supporting role perfectly, notepad, ready to document whatever violations they decided to discover, while the growing crowd of commuters across the street slowed their pace to watch what looked like it might become another viral video of police overreach. What neither officer bothered to notice was that Marcus seemed to know exactly what was happening, his calm demeanor suggesting someone who had seen this particular play performed many times before and was waiting for his cue to change the anterior script. The old man's responses were measured and polite, offering just enough cooperation to avoid immediate escalation, while revealing nothing that might satisfy their curiosity about who he really was or why he had chosen this particular corner for his vigil. The conversation that followed was predictably one-sided until Marcus spoke just two words that stopped Martinez cold in his tracks. "Badge 2847, Marcus said quietly, and suddenly the young officer's confident posture crumbled as he realized this homeless man somehow knew his badge number, a detail that should have been impossible for a random vagrant to possess. Johnson, missing the significance of the moment, entirely continued his aggressive questioning while Marcus maintained that unsettling calm, occasionally glancing toward a black SUV that had pulled up across the street and was now idling with tinted windows that made it impossible to see who might be watching this entire encounter unfold. The photograph in Marcus's hands caught a drop of rain, and he carefully wiped it dry with a gentleness that suggested this small piece of paper was more valuable to him than anything else in the world. Martinez found himself staring at the old man's face, something familiar tugging at the edges of his memory, a recognition that he could not quite place, but that made his stomach tighten with an emotion he did not understand. District Attorney Michael Brennan had been monitoring FBI communications about the investigation when Agent Collins radioed that the situation was escalating beyond their plan, forcing him to make a decision that could either salvage months of careful preparation or destroy a case that had consumed his entire career focus for the past year. As a former law clerk who had learned constitutional procedure from Marcus Chen 20 years earlier, Brennan understood both the legal implications and the personal stakes of what was unfolding on that rainy street corner. His arrival was not coincidental, but carefully timed to provide legal authority for whatever federal intervention might be necessary, though he hoped that simply showing up would be enough to prevent two officers from making the kind of mistake that could compromise everything they had worked to accomplish. The black SUV moved through traffic with the kind of purposeful urgency that suggested its passenger was someone accustomed to having situations handled quickly and efficiently, the diplomatic plates and tinted windows marking it as definitely not just another curious observer stopping to watch the show. Without warning, Johnson decided that talking was taking too long and grabbed Marcus by the arm, hauling him to his feet with enough force to cause the elderly man to stumble slightly before regaining his balance. The crowd across the street immediately pulled out phones to capture what looked like a textbook example of police officers abusing their authority against someone who could not fight back. But Marcus showed no inclination to resist or call for help, instead allowing Martinez to secure handcuffs around his wrists while maintaining a dignity that seemed almost supernatural under the circumstances. As the metal clicked into place, the precious photograph slipped from Marcus's fingers and fluttered toward a nearby puddle, causing him to lunge forward desperately to protect it, only to have Johnson kick it away with casual cruelty while sneering about trash cluttering up their clean streets. Martinez watched this happen with growing unease. Something about the old man's desperate attempt to save that picture, striking him as profoundly wrong, though he could not articulate why watching someone try to protect their most treasured possession should make him feel like he was participating in something shameful. That is when everything changed, though nobody realized it yet. Brennan stepped out of his vehicle with the measured pace of someone who understood that the next few moments would determine whether months of federal investigation would result in justice or disaster, his expensive suit and obvious authority immediately changing the dynamic of what had been a routine street encounter. Marcus looked directly at Brennan and gave the slightest nod, a gesture so subtle that only someone watching very carefully would have caught it. And suddenly I realized that whatever was about to happen had been planned long before these. Two officers decided to make this the worst mistake of their careers. The rain continued to fall, mixing with something that might have been tears on Marcus's weathered face as he stood there in handcuffs, no longer looking like a broken homeless man, but somehow transformed into someone whose quiet dignity commanded respect even in the most degrading circumstances. The question hanging in the air, unspoken but electric with possibility, was simple yet profound. Who exactly had they just arrested, and why was one of Chicago's most powerful legal officials rushing across a rain-soaked street like his entire career depended on the next 30 seconds? District Attorney Michael Brennan approached the scene with the careful composure of someone who had spent 20 years managing complex legal situations. But inside, he was calculating how to salvage an operation that had suddenly gone off-script in ways that could either advance or destroy the most important case of his career. The recognition of his former mentor sitting in handcuffs on a Chicago sidewalk hit him like a physical blow, memories flooding back to his days as a nervous law clerk, learning constitutional procedure from one of the most respected judges in the federal system. Officers, Brennan said with measured authority, "I believe there may be some misunderstanding here about this gentleman's status," his words chosen carefully to establish his authority without immediately revealing the full scope of what they had stumbled into. Johnson looked annoyed at the interruption, while Martinez seemed relieved that someone with obvious power had arrived to potentially diffuse a situation that was making him increasingly uncomfortable, though neither officer yet understood how dramatically their evening was about to change. Marcus spoke for the first time since his arrest, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded respect in federal courtrooms across the country. "Officer Martinez, I believe you should examine my identification more carefully," he said, nodding toward the worn wallet that Johnson had dismissively tossed aside after finding no driver's license or credit cards inside. Martinez retrieved the wallet with trembling hands and found what Johnson had missed in his haste to process another vagrant: a Federal Bureau of Investigation consultant badge and an official authorization letter signed by the FBI director himself, documents that transformed this routine street clearing into a potential federal incident with implications neither local officer was qualified to handle. The badge was real, the letter bore official seals, and suddenly everything about this encounter shifted from simple police work to something that could destroy careers if handled incorrectly, though the full implications would not become clear until the next few moments unfolded. The real shock came when Martinez read the name on the badge and his face went white as childhood memories crashed over him like a wave. "Judge Chen," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion as he realized exactly who they had arrested. "You are the one who saved my life 5 years ago." The backstory tumbled out in fragments as Martinez explained to his confused partner how a drug-addicted 23-year-old had ended up in federal court facing 5 years in prison, only to encounter a judge who saw potential where everyone else saw another statistic destined for destruction. Instead of the harsh sentence that prosecutors had demanded, Judge Chen had offered probation with the condition that Martinez enroll in police academy and dedicate his life to helping others avoid the mistakes. He had made a decision that had literally transformed a hopeless addict into the officer he was today. Johnson listened to this revelation with growing alarm, realizing that his routine harassment of a homeless man had somehow become entangled with federal authority and his partner's personal history in ways that he could not possibly have anticipated. As the scene developed, Brennan found himself managing multiple competing interests while maintaining the careful balance necessary to protect both the investigation and the individuals involved in what was rapidly becoming a public spectacle. His relationship with Marcus went beyond professional respect to personal gratitude, since his own career had been shaped by the mentorship he had received as a young law clerk, learning how to balance justice with compassion in cases that involved vulnerable populations who rarely received adequate legal representation. The FBI investigation had been his idea, born from conversations with Marcus about systematic patterns of civil rights violations that required federal intervention to address. But seeing his mentor in handcuffs reminded him that even the most carefully planned operations could have unintended consequences that tested everyone's commitment to both justice and humanity. The crowd across the street had grown larger and more vocal, their phones capturing every moment of what was becoming a viral video that would dominate social media within hours. Marcus remained calm as he explained his presence on the streets, revealing that for the past 6 months he had been conducting an authorized FBI consultation, documenting patterns of police harassment against the homeless population as part of a broader federal investigation into civil rights violations that Brennan had been coordinating from the district attorney's office. The recording device hidden in his jacket had captured not just this encounter but dozens of similar incidents, creating a comprehensive database of systematic abuse that would serve as evidence in what was about to become one of the largest police corruption cases in Chicago history. The cooperation between federal and local authorities represented an unusual level of coordination, with Brennan using his position to facilitate FBI access to local records while maintaining the plausible deniability necessary for an effective undercover operation that could have been compromised by premature exposure. Martinez listened to this explanation with growing horror as he realized that his own participation in Johnson's move them along tactics had been documented, his gambling debts and desperation for extra money leading him to participate in behavior that violated everything Judge Chen had tried to teach him about justice and dignity. Officer Johnson, watching his comfortable routine of intimidation and small-time corruption crumble before his eyes, made the worst decision possible by grabbing the recording device and hurling it into a nearby storm drain, an act of evidence destruction that transformed his misdemeanor misconduct into a felony obstruction of justice charge. The desperate move backfired immediately, as Marcus calmly informed him that the device automatically uploaded recordings to a secure FBI server every 15 minutes, meaning that the destruction of physical evidence had been captured, transmitted while accomplishing nothing except adding federal charges to Johnson's growing list of legal problems. Brennan watched this unfold with the horrified fascination of someone seeing months of careful planning nearly destroyed by the panic of a corrupt officer who had just realized that his criminal behavior was about to be exposed to federal prosecutors who specialized in civil rights cases. As the full scope of the situation became clear, Martinez faced the hardest decision of his life. Torn between loyalty to his partner who had promised easy money to solve his financial problems and the moral code that Judge Chen had tried to instill in him years earlier, when a young addict had needed someone to believe in his potential for redemption. The gambling addiction that had made him vulnerable to Johnson's recruitment in the first place now seemed like a distant problem compared to the immediate crisis of choosing between his career and his conscience, while the growing crowd of witnesses made it impossible to pretend that whatever happened next would remain private. Brennan recognized the young officer's anguish and made a calculated decision to provide legal cover for whatever choice Martinez made, understanding that the success of the broader investigation might depend on whether one corrupt officer could find the courage to do the right thing when everything was on the line. Johnson continued to bluster about false accusations and planted evidence threatening Martinez with exposure of his gambling debts and warning him about the consequences of betraying a partner who had protected him from departmental scrutiny for months while they collected unauthorized fees from vulnerable people who had no choice but to pay or face arrest on fabricated charges. But Martinez could see the truth in Judge Chen's eyes, the same clarity and wisdom that had seen potential in a drug-addicted kid when everyone else had given up hope. And he realized that this moment would define not just his career, but the kind of person he would be for the rest of his life. The choice arrived when Johnson ordered Martinez to arrest Judge Chen for filing false reports, a command that would have completed the young officer's transformation from someone saved by the justice system into someone who perverted it for personal gain. Instead, Martinez reached for his handcuffs and slowly, deliberately placed them on his partner's wrists while speaking words that would haunt Johnson forever. "Detective Johnson, you are under arrest for civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and obstruction of a federal investigation." The crowd erupted in cheers as phone cameras captured the moment when justice finally arrived for someone who had spent years abusing his authority. But Martinez felt no satisfaction, only the profound sadness of someone who had discovered that doing the right thing sometimes meant destroying the life of someone who had offered friendship when friendship was desperately needed. Judge Chen looked at his former defendant with something that might have been pride recognizing in that moment the man that scared kid had always had the potential to become. With Johnson secured in the back of the patrol car, Martinez collapsed emotionally, confessing not just his own participation in the harassment scheme, but revealing the full scope of a corruption network that had consumed his life for the past 8 months. The gambling addiction had started innocently enough with weekend poker games at a local bar, but escalated into crushing debt to loan sharks who had threatened his mother's safety when payments fell behind, creating the desperation that made Johnson's offer of easy money through quality of life enforcement seem like salvation rather than corruption. 47 homeless individuals had been arrested over 6 months, with those who could pay $50 move-along fees being released, while those who couldn't were processed through the system on fabricated charges that were later quietly dropped to avoid judicial scrutiny that might expose the entire operation. Martinez spoke through tears as he described how each arrest had felt like a betrayal of everything Judge Chen had tried to teach him about dignity and justice, but the fear of losing his mother's medical coverage had made him rationalize behavior that violated his deepest beliefs about what police work should represent. Agent Sarah Collins arrived at the scene with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested months of careful planning rather than emergency response, her presence confirming that Marcus's investigation had been part of a larger, federal operation that required coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions. Collins had been tracking similar patterns of systematic harassment in 12 major cities, but Chicago represented the most sophisticated version of this scheme, with developers, police officials, and city planners working together to maximize both public safety narratives and private profit margins that depended on removing visible poverty from areas targeted for economic development. The timing of her arrival had been coordinated with Brennan's office to ensure that local legal authority was present to handle any complications that might arise from the undercover operation, though none of them had anticipated that the situation would escalate to actual arrests so quickly, or that personal connections would play such a dramatic role in the evening's events. The emotional core of Marcus's motivation became clear as he shared the story of his late wife Sarah, a brilliant social worker who had experienced homelessness herself before they met during a legal aid clinic 30 years earlier. when he was still a young attorney learning how to balance legal principles with human compassion. Her insights into the systematic failures that created and perpetuated homelessness had shaped his judicial philosophy, leading to decisions that prioritized rehabilitation over punishment and human dignity over bureaucratic efficiency. Approaches that had sometimes brought criticism from prosecutors who preferred harsh sentences to complex social solutions that required patience and resources. After Sarah's death from cancer 2 years earlier, Marcus had struggled with retirement until FBI Director Harrison approached him about consulting on civil rights investigations, offering him a chance to honor his wife's memory by protecting the vulnerable populations she had dedicated her life to serving through advocacy and direct assistance that often went unrecognized by the broader community. For District Attorney Brennan, this investigation represented the culmination of a career spent trying to balance political necessity with moral obligation, a challenge that had become increasingly difficult as public pressure for tough-on-Bren's crime policies conflicted with evidence about the effectiveness of rehabilitation and social services in addressing root causes of criminal behavior. His decision to cooperate with the FBI investigation had been controversial within his own office, where prosecutors worried that exposing police corruption would undermine their ability to secure convictions in legitimate criminal cases that depended on officer testimony and departmental cooperation. But Brennan believed that systematic civil rights violations represented a greater threat to public safety than the temporary disruption caused by holding law enforcement accountable for illegal behavior. The success or failure of this case would likely determine his political future, but more importantly, it would establish whether local authorities could work with federal agencies to address corruption without destroying the trust necessary for effective law enforcement in communities that desperately needed both protection and justice. Agent Collins confirmed that Marcus's 6 months of documentation had provided the FBI with probable cause for a massive investigation that would ultimately involve multiple federal agencies, including the Internal Revenue Service for tax evasion charges and the Environmental Protection Agency for violations related to illegal dumping in areas where homeless camps had been cleared to make way for development projects. The recordings revealed not just individual acts of misconduct, but systematic patterns that could support federal racketeering charges against a conspiracy that included police officers, developers, city officials, and organized crime figures who provided financing for the whole operation, while remaining carefully insulated from direct involvement in street-level harassment. Martinez's cooperation would be crucial for understanding how the scheme operated at ground level, but his decision to arrest Johnson had already demonstrated a commitment to justice that would serve him well in the difficult months ahead, as federal prosecutors built their case against a network that had generated millions in illegal profits. Word of the arrest spread quickly through Chicago's homeless community, with dozens of witnesses coming forward to share their own experiences of harassment, illegal arrests, and demands for payment to avoid detention stories that had been dismissed or ignored by traditional media, but now found an audience through social media platforms, where videos of the arrest were being shared and discussed by thousands of people who recognized the broader implications of what they having prions were seeing. Sister Joan McBride, director of the downtown homeless shelter where Marcus had been volunteering, arrived with additional evidence, including photographs of injuries sustained during routine arrests and testimony from individuals who had been too frightened to report abuse until they learned that someone with real authority was finally listening to their stories and taking action to protect them from further harassment. The coordinated attack on Marcus's reputation was swift, sophisticated, and clearly expensive, suggesting resources and expertise far beyond what local police corruption could afford to purchase, with carefully planted stories appearing simultaneously across multiple news outlets, questioning everything from his mental health to his qualifications as an FBI consultant. Anonymous sources provided detailed accounts of Marcus's supposed psychological breakdown following his wife's death, claiming that grief had triggered delusional episodes that left him unable to distinguish between reality, elaborate fantasies of persecution, and conspiracy that had consumed his rational thinking. The most damaging allegation was that he had been asked to leave his volunteer position at the homeless shelter after making threatening comments about police officers and city officials, a lie that seemed credible enough to make even supportive community members begin to question whether they had misjudged the situation entirely. Television reporters interviewed unnamed former colleagues who expressed concern about Marcus's mental stability, while social media accounts began circulating rumors about erratic behavior and paranoid accusations that painted him as a disturbed individual whose grief had evolved into dangerous delusions. For the first time since beginning his investigation, Marcus found himself questioning not just his methods, but his entire sense of reality, wondering if perhaps the critics were right that a 75-year-old man had no business trying to solve problems that had defeated generations of social workers, politicians, and law enforcement professionals with far more resources and institutional support. The systematic nature of the character assassination felt overwhelming, with every aspect of his personal life being scrutinized and twisted to support the narrative that he was a disturbed individual whose grief had evolved into dangerous delusions that threatened both public safety and the reputations of dedicated public servants who were simply trying to do their jobs effectively. Even Agent Collins seemed to waver when her superiors at the FBI received calls from high-ranking officials suggesting that perhaps the Bureau's consultant had become too emotionally invested in his work to maintain the plus objectivity required for a federal investigation that needed to meet the highest standards of professional conduct and legal scrutiny. District Attorney Brennan found himself caught between his personal loyalty to Marcus and the political reality that his cooperation with the FBI investigation was generating criticism from powerful interests within the Chicago political establishment who viewed any examination of police practices as an attack on law enforcement, credibility, and public safety priorities. The mayor's office had received calls from influential donors expressing concern about the investigation's impact on the city's reputation for effective governance, while police union leadership was threatening to withdraw in support for Brennan's upcoming re-election campaign if he continued to provide assistance to federal authorities, who seemed determined to undermine officer morale and departmental efficiency through what they characterized as a Frostens Evan died, politically motivated witch hunt. The pressure was intense and personal, with longtime political allies suggesting that his association with a potentially unstable former judge could destroy everything he had worked to accomplish over 2 decades in public service, leaving him isolated and vulnerable to attacks from opponents who would use his cooperation with federal authorities against him in future campaigns. The breaking point came when Marcus received a call from Sister Joan at the homeless shelter, informing him with obvious reluctance that the shelter's board of directors had voted to suspend his volunteer privileges pending a comprehensive review of the allegations that had been made about his conduct and mental stability through media reports that painted him as a potentially dangerous individual. The decision was presented as a temporary measure designed to protect both Marcus and the shelter's clients, while the truth could be determined through proper investigation, but the implicit message was clear that even people who had worked closely with him for months were beginning to doubt his version of events and question whether his assistance had been motivated by genuine concern or psychological instability. That night alone in his small apartment, Marcus stared at Sarah's photograph and wondered if she would recognize the man he had become, whether his quest for justice had transformed into the kind of obsession that justified the concerns being raised about his psychological condition and fitness for the responsibility he had assumed. The most painful moment came when Marcus returned to the shelter the next morning and found that several homeless individuals whom he had been helping were now avoiding eye contact, their trust apparently shaken by news reports suggesting that his assistance might have been motivated by mental illness rather than genuine concern for their welfare and dignity. One elderly veteran whom Marcus had helped obtain disability benefits actually asked him to stop coming around, explaining that the shelter's social workers had warned that association with someone under federal investigation might jeopardize residents' access to services and housing assistance that they desperately needed to survive. The rejection felt like a physical blow, confirming Marcus's worst fears, that his efforts to help had actually caused harm to the people he cared most about protecting. And for the first time since Sarah's death, he seriously considered giving up entirely on a mission that seemed to be causing more damage than good to everyone involved. Just as it seemed that the investigation would collapse under the weight of public skepticism and political pressure, Martinez made a breakthrough that changed everything, using his suspension period to conduct independent research into the media campaign that had so effectively undermined Marcus's credibility and transformed him from respected legal authority into suspected mental patient whose testimony could no longer be trusted by anyone who mattered in the pursuit of justice. Agent Collins worked with Marcus and Brennan to design a sophisticated sting operation that would take advantage of Blackstone's overconfidence following his apparently successful media campaign, using the developer's belief that he had neutralized the investigation to create opportunities for gathering evidence that would be admissible in federal court against a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple police corruption. The plan required Marcus to maintain his cover as a discredited former judge whose mental health issues had made him an unreliable witness, while FBI surveillance teams documented the ongoing coordination between police officers, development interests in clearing homeless populations from areas targeted for construction projects that would generate enormous profits. Brennan's role was crucial, as his office would provide legal cover for the operation, while maintaining plausible deniability about the extent of federal law enforcement interest in the corruption network that connected police, developers, and city officials through financial relationships that violated both civil rights laws and racketeering statutes. The breakthrough came when Martinez, working from his suspended position but still committed to redemption, managed to trace the media campaign back to its source through careful analysis of the timing and content of the planted stories that had so effectively destroyed Marcus's reputation and credibility within the community that had once respected his judgment and expertise. Working with Sister Joan and several homeless advocates who had access to legal databases through their university connections, Martinez discovered that the crisis management firm hired to discredit Marcus was the same company that had represented major corporations in environmental disasters, pharmaceutical scandals, and financial fraud cases, specializing in destroying the reputations of whistleblowers and witnesses whose testimony threatened powerful interests that could afford sophisticated public relations campaigns. The firm's client list read like a directory of corporate criminals who had escaped justice through systematic character assassination of those who threatened to expose their illegal activities to law enforcement and regulatory authorities. The investigation into the media campaign led directly to Richard Blackstone, Chicago's most successful real estate developer, who had hired the crisis management firm through a network of shell companies designed to obscure the source of funding for what was essentially a sophisticated disinformation operation aimed at protecting a criminal conspiracy that generated millions in annual revenue. But Blackstone was not just another greedy businessman trying to protect his profits from legitimate scrutiny. He was a former social worker whose brother had died of a drug overdose in a homeless encampment 15 years earlier, an experience that had transformed his worldview from liberal compassion to conservative pragmatism about the need for tough love solutions to social problems that he genuinely believed could only be solved through economic development, systematic displacement of populations that he considered dangerous to themselves and others. His wealth and influence had grown from this philosophical transformation, as he convinced investors and politicians that removing visible poverty was the same thing as solving poverty, creating profitable opportunities, while convincing himself that he was performing a public service. Believing that he had successfully neutralized the FBI investigation by discrediting its primary source, Blackstone made the fatal mistake of accelerating his timeline for the Riverfront project, scheduling preliminary construction activities for the same week that police planned to conduct a massive sweep of Chicago's largest homeless encampment through coordinated enforcement actions that would clear the area without generating the kind of media attention that had complicated previous displacement efforts. The developer's hubris led him to grant extensive interviews about his vision for transforming Chicago's waterfront, speaking openly about the need to clear human obstacles to progress, and praising the police department's commitment to enforcing quality-of-life ordinances that protected both public safety and property values from the deteriorating influence of individuals who refused to accept available social services. His language was carefully crafted to avoid explicit illegality while making his intentions absolutely clear to anyone who understood the real dynamics of urban development and the systematic use of law enforcement to advance private economic interests at the expense of constitutional rights. Marcus played his assigned role perfectly, allowing himself to be seen at the Riverfront camp where he appeared to be conducting the kind of erratic interviews with homeless individuals that reinforced media narratives about his psychological instability, while actually providing specific information about planned enforcement actions that only someone with access to confidential police communications could possess through legitimate federal authority. The homeless community, now aware of his true identity and mission, despite the public controversy that surrounded his reputation, cooperated fully by appearing to humor what seemed like the delusional fantasies of a mentally disturbed former judge, while actually helping him document the systematic harassment that occurred whenever anyone attempted to establish a permanent presence in areas marked for development by powerful interests who viewed human beings as obstacles to profit rather than citizens deserving of basic constitutional protections. FBI surveillance captured not just Blackstone's public statements, but private conversations with police commanders, city officials, and financial backers who discussed the homeless population in terms that revealed their complete dehumanization of people they considered obstacles to profit, rather than citizens deserving of basic rights and dignity that should be protected by law enforcement rather than violated through coordinated harassment campaigns designed to serve private economic interests. The FBI's coordinated operation culminated not in the dramatic television arrest that had been originally planned, but in a series of carefully executed actions that took place over the course of a single morning, with federal agents simultaneously serving search warrants at police precincts, development offices, and City Hall, while avoiding the kind of media spectacle that might compromise ongoing aspects of the investigation or create unnecessary risks for witnesses and informants who had cooperated with law enforcement. Agent Collins coordinated with prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office to ensure that all arrests were conducted according to federal guidelines for civil rights cases, while Brennan provided local legal support and coordination with Chicago police officials who were not targets of the investigation, but whose cooperation was necessary for maintaining public safety during the enforcement actions that would dismantle a criminal network operating at the highest levels of city government. Rather than being arrested at a public ceremony, Richard Blackstone was taken into custody at his office during a routine business meeting, the quiet professionalism of the FBI agents contrasting sharply with the developer's obvious shock at discovering that his sophisticated media campaign had failed to prevent federal law enforcement from gathering sufficient evidence to support criminal charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. The developer's arrest was followed immediately by the seizure of financial records, communication logs, and construction documents that revealed the full scope of a criminal enterprise that had generated over $20 million in illegal proceeds, while systematically violating the civil rights of hundreds of vulnerable individuals over a 5-year period through coordinated harassment campaigns designed to clear profitable development sites of human obstacles to economic growth. The morning's operations resulted in 37 arrests across multiple agencies and organizations, including 12 police officers, 8 city officials, 4 developers, and 13 associates involved in money laundering and racketeering activities that had operated under the cover of legitimate urban development and public safety initiatives, while actually serving private economic interests that violated both federal civil rights laws and organized crime statutes. Federal prosecutors announced that additional arrests were likely, as the investigation continued, with several high-ranking officials expected to face charges once the grand jury completed its review of evidence that included recorded conversations, financial transactions, and witness testimony that documented systematic coordination between law enforcement and private interests in ways that constituted criminal conspiracy under federal racketeering laws. The public vindication of Marcus came not through dramatic testimony or emotional speeches, but through the methodical presentation of evidence that demonstrated the accuracy of his observations and the legitimacy of his investigative methods, allowing his reputation to be restored through professional competence rather than personal sympathy or media manipulation that might have undermined the credibility of the federal case against a conspiracy that had operated with impunity for years. Agent Collins held a carefully worded press conference that acknowledged Marcus's contributions to the investigation, while avoiding language that might compromise ongoing prosecutions, emphasizing his expertise and dedication rather than the personal attacks he had endured during the character assassination campaign that had nearly destroyed both his effectiveness and his credibility within the community that had once respected his judgment. District Attorney Brennan's decision to support the federal investigation despite intense political pressure was vindicated by the scope and significance of the criminal conspiracy that was exposed, with even former critics acknowledging that his cooperation with FBI agents had been necessary to address corruption that local law enforcement agencies would have been unable to investigate effectively on their own without federal resources and jurisdiction, transcended municipal boundaries. His carefully managed public statements throughout the investigation had preserved his political viability while providing crucial legal support for federal prosecutors, demonstrating how local and federal authorities could work together to address systematic civil rights violations without undermining legitimate law enforcement activities or democratic accountability that voters expected from their elected officials. The revelation that Blackstone had funded a sophisticated disinformation campaign designed to discredit Marcus created a powerful counter-narrative that transformed public perception of the investigation from a story about a mentally unstable former judge into an account of systematic corruption and the courage required to expose it, despite personal and professional risks that included character assassination and social isolation. Investigative journalists discovered that the crisis management firm hired to destroy Marcus's reputation had used identical tactics against environmental activists, civil rights lawyers, and other whistleblowers who had threatened powerful interests, creating a broader story about the use of media manipulation to protect criminal behavior and silence legitimate criticism of systematic violations of law and ethics. The homeless community that had suffered years of harassment and systematic displacement finally received formal acknowledgement of their dignity and humanity through city officials' public apology for the violations of their civil rights. While the announcement of comprehensive reforms demonstrated that their suffering had contributed to meaningful change, rather than simply serving as evidence in a criminal prosecution that would fade from public memory once the defendants were sentenced. The settlement of federal civil rights lawsuits provided funding for expanded social services and legal protections, while new police training programs emphasized de-escalation techniques and respect for the constitutional rights of all citizens regardless of their housing status or economic circumstances. The Marcus and Sarah Chen Community Center opened its doors on a crisp spring morning, 6 months after the arrests that had transformed Chicago's approach to homelessness, police accountability, and urban development, but Marcus himself was notably absent from the opening ceremony that featured speeches from federal officials, community leaders, and formerly homeless individuals whose lives had been changed by the comprehensive reforms that had emerged from the investigation. The building that rose from a site originally intended for luxury development was designed to serve rather than impress, with comprehensive facilities for temporary housing, job training, mental health services, and legal aid that addressed the complex factors contributing to housing instability while maintaining the dignity and autonomy of the individuals it served, rather than treating them as problems to be managed or moved along to someone else's jurisdiction. While publishers offered Marcus advances exceeding $2 million for his memoir and television, producers proposed documentary projects that would have made him wealthy and famous beyond anything his federal pension could provide. Quietly declined every opportunity for celebrity, explaining to the few reporters who managed to reach him that he had not undertaken his investigation to achieve personal recognition or financial gain. Speaking bureaus promised lucrative contracts for appearances at conferences and universities, while advocacy organizations wanted him to serve as their spokesperson, and fundraising figurehead offering salaries that would have provided comfortable retirement far beyond anything his federal pension could match. But Marcus remained consistent in his refusal to profit from work that he considered a moral obligation rather than a career opportunity that should be exploited for personal advancement or public recognition. District Attorney Brennan's political survival and professional vindication allowed him to continue serving as the bridge between federal law enforcement and local community interests, using the credibility he had gained through his support of the investigation to advance additional reforms in how Chicago addressed systematic inequality and institutional corruption that had operated with impunity for decades. His office established a permanent civil rights division, specifically focused on preventing the kind of coordination between law enforcement and private interests that had characterized the criminal conspiracy, while his re-election campaign emphasized his commitment to justice over political convenience, a message that resonated with voters who had been impressed by his willingness to risk his career to support federal investigators, despite intense pressure from powerful local interests who had expected loyalty rather than accountability. Detective David Martinez, now working with the FBI's Civil Rights Task Force, had found his calling in investigating police misconduct and protecting vulnerable populations from systematic harassment, using his street-level experience and personal understanding of addiction and financial desperation to build cases against corruption while helping officers who were struggling with similar pressures to find legitimate solutions to their problems. His weekly visits to the community center served both professional and personal purposes, as he updated Marcus about ongoing investigations while maintaining the relationship with the man who had literally saved his life by offering second chances rather than harsh punishment, when rehabilitation was still possible and meaningful transformation could occur through proper guidance and support. Richard Blackstone was serving a 12-year federal sentence after his conviction on RICO charges, spending his time in a minimum security facility where he worked as a counselor for other inmates struggling with addiction, mental health issues, gradually returning to the social work principles that had originally motivated his career before grief and frustration had led him to embrace systematic displacement as a solution to problems that required compassion and comprehensive social services. His letters to local newspapers occasionally appeared as op-eds, about the need for evidence-based approaches to homelessness, marking his evolution from someone who had used personal tragedy to justify harming others into an advocate for the kind of systematic change that might prevent similar suffering in future generations who deserved better solutions than displacement and criminalization. Rather than embracing the recognition he had earned through his courage and dedication, Marcus chose to continue his quiet work at the community center, arriving each morning at 7 to help prepare breakfast for residents and spending his patient days listening to people whose stories rarely made headlines but whose struggles represented the human cost of systematic indifference and institutional failure. His presence provided both practical assistance and symbolic importance, demonstrating that even individuals with significant authority and social status could recognize the fundamental humanity and worth of people whom society preferred to ignore or remove from sight, while his refusal to accept celebrity status reinforced his commitment to service over recognition that might have distracted from the daily work of helping people rebuild their lives. On a quiet Tuesday morning, as Marcus helped serve breakfast at the community center, a young woman approached with the nervous energy of someone working up courage for an important conversation, explaining that she had been living in her car for 3 months after losing her job and apartment, but had been afraid to seek help because previous experiences with social services had been humiliating and degrading. She had seen news coverage of the investigation and decided that perhaps some people in authority positions really did care about treating homeless individuals with dignity and respect, a conclusion that Marcus validated through his patient, listening and effective connection of her needs with appropriate services, rather than bureaucratic procedures, designed more to process problems than to solve them with genuine care and comprehensive support. As Marcus listened to her story and watched her begin the process of rebuilding her life, he reflected on how Sarah would have approached this same situation, realizing that the most meaningful tribute to his wife's memory was not the recognition or the center that bore their names, but the daily opportunity to demonstrate that every person deserved compassion and respect. Ever felt powerless when witnessing injustice, wondering if one person can truly make a difference against corrupt systems? Marcus Chen's story proves that quiet courage and persistent action can topple even the most sophisticated criminal networks, showing how ordinary people become extraordinary heroes through small daily choices to stand up for what's right. His journey from respected judge to anonymous homeless advocate demonstrates that real change happens not through fame-seeking, but through consistent service to those society overlooks. If this story of redemption, justice, and quiet heroism touched your heart, please like and subscribe to Homeless Stories for more inspiring tales about people who chose courage over comfort, proving that anyone can become the hero their community needs.